Perfect. Awesome. All right. So we'll be talking about information architecture and how it relates to taxonomy. Um, oops. There we go. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite sentences in the English language. I don't know, I'm sure some of you have heard this, but this might be completely baffling to others. True or false? This is a grammatically correct sentence. Buffalo, 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 buffalo. So feel free to either say in the chat or just come up with an answer for yourself. And the answer is it's true. So English is a little wonky and context is everything is the takeaway. So the way that this actually maps is buffalo can mean three different things. It can be an animal, it can be Buffalo, New York, and then it also means to bully. So what they're actually saying is buffalo bison, that other buffalo bison bully, also bully buffalo bison. So I'm going to let that sink in for a second. And now I want to take you through something that's a little more sane and can kind of ground us a little bit as an example. But think of the word crane. What's the first definition that comes to mind? Again, would love it if you put it in the chat. Want everyone to kind of see what everyone's thinking. And then if anyone wants to shout out, feel free to unmute yourself and let me know your first thoughts. Anyone? Who's thinking of the bird, the crane? Some. Who's thinking of the building tool? Construction tool. Yep. There we go. So the meaning of crane ultimately depends on the context, right? We have a lot of this in the English language. We have the same word that can have a lot of different meanings. And the way that we actually make sense of it is looking at everything around it, right? So if you were given a bunch of words associated with wildlife, right? Like habitat, all of that, you would probably much more quickly jump to the word meaning the bird, right? Whereas if you are looking at, building a house and construction and all of that, you'd probably much more quickly jump to the definition of this is a machine that I use. So what does this tell us? Content matters, but context is crucial in orienting your audience. So before you even come up with words for things, you really have to set that context for the end users and make sure that they kind of know what room they're in, right? Or what are we even talking about? So we can set this context through information architecture. Information architecture is how you group information, and it's the backbone of your content strategy. So basically, someone should be able to tell what crane you're referring to based on what you put around it. Information architecture is also similar to building architecture. So depending on the use case, you would architect a building differently. So I want you to think about what are the rooms and objects that are prioritized in your house versus your office versus a hotel. So you're probably going to make different design decisions depending on which one you're interacting with or which one you're going to, right? So we can use restroom as an example. How might restroom placement differ between your home, your office, and your hotel, right? And then how might the word we use for restroom change based on that context? So an example is, if you're at your home, it's a lot more casual. You're probably having friends over, and I would personally refer to it as a bathroom, right? If I'm at a friend's house, like I'm going to the bathroom. And it's going to be intuitively, I'll probably, unless it's a very oddly new age house, I'll probably be able to find it with minimal poking around, right? What about for an office or a hotel, right? Those are public areas. So bathroom needs to be even more accessible, right? It needs to be Very easy to find potentially in the beginning of the building experience. And the word we use might change, right? We might want to be a little bit more proper. We might want to say restroom, washroom, right? Depending on who you're talking to, culture, all of that. So what ultimately makes a good information architecture, and how do we get there? So a good information architecture is obviously clear, intuitive, and provides crucial context for your audience. It should also support your product vision and strategy. And creating a good information architecture is sort of a mix of science and art, right? There's frameworks and tools that we can put into place that have been vetted, but a lot of it is kind of creativity, understanding your audience, figuring out like what's the best solution here. And sometimes it's not always, what you initially thought. So I want to run through a quick case study. I won't spend too much time on this, but when I was at Handshake, we did a huge information architecture overhaul, and we were looking at taxonomy kind of in parallel. And for some context, Handshake is the leading platform for connecting students to jobs and internships. So it's not just a job board. It's not just LinkedIn for college students. It's actually, their vision is really connecting students with people in the professional world that they can actually, interact with to get their first job, internship, and build their career. And so the problem we originally had was the product had been developed as a lot of different features. Like we wanted to do a lot of things with it, right? We're like, wouldn't it be cool if students could connect with each other and have a social aspect to it? Or if we had, Q&A where they could go and interact with that. And the reality was it was just too disorganized. There was no perspective, and a lot of students found it very difficult to use. They would land on the page and not really know, what was the right thing to do, what would actually make them successful in this product. So here's kind of what it looked like in action with a lot of double navigation. I know, gross. But, put all this together to sort of show there's just a lot of questions and a lot of chaos for features that, could be very effective. It's just that the way that they're kind of grouped and the prioritization of them just wasn't quite fitting with the student need. So the vision was to create a framework we can scale, for the next 3 to 5 years and not have to change it up a lot, based on the following product goals: demystify the interview process, build relationships with employers, and become the one-stop shop for students to find their next job. How did we approach it? We started with the big picture. So user personas, user journeys, product vision, really making sure we were meeting our users' needs and understanding them, and then also making sure our product vision was in line with what would make them successful. And then we identified product UX constraints and got creative with explorations and iterations, and then tested them. So lots of site maps and different organization of information, and kind of testing that with users to see what was most intuitive. So a few tools that I really like to use when I develop IA, that I think this one's kind of less common. First thing I did for this project was looked at all of our features. I did a full audit of everything the product did, right? And we went through the exercise of using the 5 whys for each of those features to really get to the crux of what was the point of this? Like, why did we create this feature, and like, how is this going to make our end user successful? So an example was we had the ability to search for other students. Why would someone do that? To find other students, right? Why would you need to find other students? To get career path ideas or talk to them, right? To either commiserate, but in this case, it was looking at someone that maybe had a similar background to you and, got a job that you really wanted. Why would you want to do that? To brainstorm job options. Why? To narrow down jobs to apply to, and then eventually get ready to find a job. And another tool that I absolutely love, and I think is usually the starting point of any ambiguous project that I take on, concept maps. They really help you visualize relationships between various concepts and then test your understanding of those concepts. And I find these to be a very good tool when working with stakeholders, because it kind of takes people out of that. People have a lot of associations with words. They come very charged with opinions of we should call it this, we should call it that. And talking about it kind of abstractly and visually and like taking them out of that rut I find is very helpful to kind of get alignment on understanding of like, what is the core information that we are actually, trying to communicate here, and how does it relate to each other? So yeah, I would go, when I do a concept map, I go very literal. If anyone looks at one of those, they're going to be like, this is not a content strategist. Who's this person? Like, why are they just writing out like the detail, like uncreative names, etc. But the whole point of this is to get understanding and alignment on what are the concepts that we're talking about and what are some of the gaps that we can identify through this. And then once you make sense of kind of that status quo and where you want to go, laws of UX. I shared this with my design team this morning, and a bunch of people replied, this is, oh my God, I forgot about this. I learned about this in school and realized I should be referring to all of these when I do design work. So these are just a few that are, I like to apply for content strategy. Hicks law, is a particularly good one. So think about where you want to put things that people need to access quickly, right? So that needs to be, where would you put that? Do you like nestle it under a few things? Probably not. You want to make it very quick access. Here's an example. So to wrap up, how did this revamp ultimately influence our taxonomy? So through all of that work and the research and user testing we did, and then product strategy, we finally defined our context and kind of the vision as being the place for students to find a job, get help, and start their careers. Moving forward, word choice and definitions need to support this context. So I added a few examples here. So one was, originally we had a icon for messages in the upper right corner, which made sense, right? If you're reaching out to an employer, getting an invitation, or like talking to an employer or a student, you would get a message. As our product evolved and as we realized, we're doing so much more than that, we are actually connecting students to employers. With COVID, we did a full pivot to virtual events. We realized it actually made more sense to label it inbox, because that way it gave us a lot of room to grow into it. Like in an inbox, right, we could design it in different ways. We could have a section with people they've met. We could have a section with invitations, and have those be separate and actioned differently and treated differently than just a message. So that was one. And then we were using the word meeting to describe students interacting with employers on our platform. And we kind of realized, now that we have this context of, hey, like this is all going to propel you to get your, first job, your internship, build your career, get on here and like meet people, talk to people, all of that. We realized meeting wasn't really conveying that. It doesn't really have a lot of, like intrinsic, I guess the word I'm looking for is, it's not really pushing you towards your end goal necessarily, right? So then we kind of rethought, and we're like, okay, we probably don't necessarily need an umbrella for all of these, different types of interactions. We should just be specific, right? If you're talking to an employer and you are interviewing for your job, you're having a virtual interview, right? We had coffee chats where if you wanted to do, a quick 15-minute chat with to learn more about a role, workshops, all of that. And the word choice for all of those ultimately leads the student to the end goal, right? So if you're interviewing for something, you want to get that job, right? It's showing that that is the ultimate outcome of it. Coffee chat is a casual interaction where you can get more information and build rapport with someone. So with that, let's dig in a little bit deeper with discussions. And if anyone wants to connect on LinkedIn and talk content, I am always open to that. I love content strategy. So yeah, happy to, if anyone has questions, reach out to me, or just want to grab a virtual drink and trade war stories. Always happy to do that. And then I also added my dog because he is very cute and would love to meet all of you as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maria. All right, folks, feel free to chime in with any questions. Let's get the conversation going here. I know there were quite a few chats, Maria, if you want to catch up on some things that people said, if anything stood out to you as well.
Perfect.
So I have a question about hierarchies, right? Like when we have terms that fit within certain hierarchies, you know, different business verticals, or you know, IT functions versus finance functions and things like that. In your work with Handshake, did you encounter this, and how did you resolve some of those thornier issues?
Can you clarify a little bit what you meant? So the different functions, like different job functions, and are you asking about how they were organized, how we organized the jobs on the platform?
Well, yeah, I mean, potentially, you know, the back end business side of a taxonomy, right? So you have your public facing language and how you characterize things with your communities, and then you have sort of how you operationalize those in the background. Is there a pardon the pun, is there a handshake between those two things?
Got it. Yeah. So when I left, I think they were sort of in the process of figuring that out. They were definitely feeling a very common pain point where, you know, we had used things in the product before. We had, you know, content strategists at the company, and they had hard coded that into our engineering taxonomy. And there was at some point, you know, that turns into a discrepancy. And the only way to really get over that is you have to go back and you have to re-architect and like rethink that taxonomy. I don't think they were it wasn't at that point where it was such a big issue, because they were still pretty small at that point. But I know that was on their roadmap to figure out, like, just based on how we were redesigning the end user experience. And what that would mean for our engineers to make their jobs a lot more efficient as they were, you know, building the back end. Does that answer your question a little bit?
It does. I mean, you know, we have, I don't want to speak for the Pandora folks on the call, but SiriusXM, we're a music company, and we have lots of different taxonomies that we end up working with. We have, you know, satellite radio products. We've got streaming app products. We've got, you know, desktop versions of our services. We've got different, you know, we've got Howard Stern, and he has 4 channels, and like all of this other stuff, right? So getting, you know, making a taxonomy actionable is a big challenge for us, and that was helpful. I don't get me wrong, that definitely was helpful, because it is a struggle.
Yeah, it's a common one. The thing with taxonomies and style guides and all of that is, and I think one of the speakers touched upon this, but they're living, breathing docs, right? They're constantly changing. Like, I know 5 years ago, we were still using whitelist, blacklist, right? And now that's a no term. So I think it's always sort of just a balance between what do you like implement now and just go, you know what, this is the right thing to do. We're moving forward with this. And then at what point do you go back and kind of look at the big picture and how do we reorganize this? And I think that was one of the big, huge parts of that project that we did for IA. Because we didn't want to come back and have to re-architect everything. So that was one of the big considerations, was where do we want to be in 5 years? Where are we now? And how do we create an organization structure that's broad enough that we can grow into it, but still like accurate enough that the user, you know, is like, we're really serving the user in the here and now.
I've got a question. I wanted to ask, the title of the talk was Getting Cross-Functional Alignment on Information Architecture. So I wondered if you could give any kind of examples about your cross-functional challenges, because I know I've worked with developers, and I've also experienced conflict between UX designers and content strategists. So any enlightenment in that area you can give is great.
Yeah, absolutely. My approach with this project, and I was really lucky with, stakeholders that were very reasonable and weren't necessarily super attached to, their opinions, on this. So I always just take the testing approach, right? So I bring people along the way early, make sure that we do checkpoints throughout, right? Like, don't show them necessarily how the sausage is made, but make sure that they feel like they were consulted, right? So things like product strategy, where we are now, right? Like going to the background. So showing that, hey, we're doing a thorough analysis of this. So there were concepts that I kind of came up with at the beginning where I was like, just want to put feelers out there. How are we feeling about this? So I think just making people feel part of it was a big portion of kind of doing that ahead of time. As we kind of progressed, it just comes down to testing, right? That's really the silver bullet is we did a lot of different explorations, a lot of kind of wireframing, re-architecting, reorganizing things based on different frameworks, right? We actually had the two that we ultimately did user testing for. One, we were really excited for events. We were like, why don't we split up events into employer events and then university events, right? Because the hypothesis was students are going to be in a different mindset when they're interacting with employers one-on-one versus when they're interacting with their career center, right? And then the purpose of those events is different. One is for career progression and the other one is for more learning and kind of building up their tool set and kind of that mentorship. So we tested splitting those up and we called one bucket meet employers. So basically employer events, we have this hypothesis that people are going to be excited to do that. And then we had another bucket that was, get support or help or, get ready. And we actually found that students were not thinking about events as separate at all. They were all thinking about them as one. So we tested that version with that vocabulary and a very simple, just kind of cleaned up, helped prioritize, events are really important. Obviously, bread and butter of job search is very important there. And user testing, we did a moderated user test with a bunch of students and asked them questions of, where would you go to find this? What is your perception if you're using this new handshake, what's the value you would get? So we were very careful about putting those questions in place. And it was just obvious, right, that, people were very confused by one versus another. So even though everyone was really excited about this move to relationships and meeting employers and building those, connections, we actually heard from most students, that's really cool, but that's really intimidating. And that's not necessarily where I would go for if I was, going to an information session or, an employer event. That makes me feel like I can't just sit there and take in the knowledge. It means that I have to actually, actively interact with them. So there was a lot of misconception there. So yeah, by the end of it, it was just the data ultimately does the talking. So my strategy is always whenever you're butting heads, which you always do with words, because everyone is a writer, everyone uses words in their day-to-day language. And so everyone's got a connotation, right? And there's certain words you like, certain words you don't like. I always just come back to testing, move people away from those words, make sure we're talking about the concepts and we're on the same page, and then testing the actual organization and the language to make a decision. Awesome. Does anyone else have thoughts on this? Any other tactics you guys are using that are really effective with bringing stakeholders along? Everyone's very quiet today.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Rick. I work at Spotify now, and I worked at Intuit with Morgan. She did the presentation earlier.
Awesome.
I would say as far as working with stakeholders, a lot of it, especially if there's not a lot of knowledge around taxonomy, is like you said, bring them along, make them feel like they're involved. And one of the best ways to do this, in my experience, is to ask lots of questions, right? Ask about what they're doing, what their priorities are, and where they have pain points, right? So if you let them kind of, front load stuff, and then you can start suggesting the things that you can do to make those things easier, right? And because it's usually, even if the long-term, solution is going to be better for them, there's going to be a lift generally to moving to reclassifying information or introducing new methodologies. So you want them to see how it's going to benefit them before they have to start doing the work, to make them feel like doing the work is going to be worthwhile, right? And then at that point, it's like, once you've got the thing up, right? It's like, the thing I always said it Intuit is, if you build it, they will come, right? And, so we had to get an initial partner and client, to work with us. And, once we were able to run that, and like you said, do testing, show metrics, show how it works. And then it was easy, right? At that point, to get additional teams to join us, right? But the initial thing is kind of, setting up that space. And it's, you have to have kind of a service mindset, right? It's like, what problems are you having? What are you trying to do? What do you wish you could do differently? And then you can start suggesting, it's like, okay, well, if we did these things, we could make some of this stuff go away, right? We could focus your energies on the stuff you really want to do instead of these administrative tasks, which a good IA or a good taxonomy can help lift from your shoulders.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that.
I have a question. I wanted to see if you have any strategies around addressing a situation where, like, your users' understanding of a category is different from the content that you actually have from that category. So like an example I'm facing is, say in home buying, we have a lot of content around inspections and appraisals for people who are buying a home, but our users like strongly indicated that they associated that with selling a home. And so aside from making sure to very clearly place it within the correct category so that users understand what kind of information they're going to see, is there any other approaches to kind of closing that gap, basically?
Yeah, so when I think of content, and if anyone has an answer to, like, much better answer to this, please chime in. This is a discussion, but when I think of content, I really think about it horizontally, right? So I think a lot of content is kind of siloed into, you have marketing content strategy, then you have product content strategy, sales support content strategy, help center, all of that. They all work together, right? So IA is not going to solve every problem, right? It's the backbone, like I said. And then you have taxonomy on top of that and kind of what you name things. From my experience, a lot of products actually overname things, and there's other solutions to that. Basically, if you want to give people a little bit more context, you have other tools. You have, the interaction design strategy, right? You have, content marketing that you can incorporate into your product and kind of orient people that way. There's other, like, have potentially like banners, or have like an onboarding tour where it's like, hey, like, selling a home, by the way, or like buying a home, like, you realize, like, these are really important, check this out over here. So I don't know necessarily, like, yes, if you, I guess, what's for in your experience, or like your example, are they going to that category and finding things and being confused about them, or are they just not finding it?
Yeah, I think it's more, so right now I'm coming from a situation where we have no external or user-facing organization. It's all internal. Traffic generally comes from an organic search. We're trying to organize it in a user-centered way so that people can navigate and find things. And so I'm trying to make sure that people can find things. And so I guess I'm just trying to reconcile, like, when somebody's natural understanding of where, like, when they would be looking for something doesn't match up with when we would present it to them, because the actual subject matter of the content isn't the same. So like, we wouldn't put our appraisals content into selling a home because it's not geared for people selling a home. but our users somehow are in the mindset that they would only think about it when they were selling a home. So yeah, I mean, my solution is that like, if we place it in the right place, they will understand that I'm reading content about buying a home. So what I'm about to read is going to be related to that. But I was just wondering if there's any other strategies other than letting the content team know we need more content around this in other areas too.
I mean, sometimes like reframing it can be really helpful. So instead of just having a section on appraisals, like maybe separating that out, like, hey, like for appraisal for buying a home and appraisals for selling a home, and see what kind of that organization looks like and whether it makes sense to split up that content. Or, you know, you can obviously organize it as like, I don't know, like home values or whatever, and have that as a section, and then have them like appraisals, all of that. So I would just play around with it, honestly. Like the way that's kind of why I was saying information architecture is a science and an art. Science is if you have a hypothesis of like, if we split it up there, you know, we think more people are going to find this, test it. Do a quick, like, it doesn't have to be a full study. Sometimes like I even pulse check with just people I know. And just want to get like a sense of direction. Like, does it make sense for us to even put together a wireframe and put this in front of customers? You know, what are the options we have basically? So that's why I like, it's very visual. I'm very visual, but information architecture is also very visual. And that's why I love concept maps for it. And I love kind of doing that sort of audit and analysis and just placing all of the different pieces. And then you can kind of look at, okay, which ones fit together, which ones overlap, and then which ones can be separated out. Because it really, all the information architecture is like how you bucket. It's a bucketing system, right? It's how you organize different concepts in a way that like people would just intuitively know. And then you have obviously like other tools that you can use to help orient them. So like signposts, right? So for example, you know, in a house, you don't need a you know, sign pointing someone to a restroom, right? Because it's small enough, and usually houses, you know, put restrooms in places that make sense. But for an office building or a hotel, like, yeah, they're going to have to label, you know, where to go for that. So yeah, I honestly just sit down, play around, reorganize, and then testing. That's really the silver bullet, honestly, especially when it comes to presenting things to stakeholders. So,
All right, can I jump in here?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you're fortunate in that you do have, you know, that your users do have a couple of very clear buckets. You know, that, you know, you have a pretty good sense of what their mental map is, you know, for this, and that one of the biggest ones is buying a home. So if you know that bucket, and that people tend to think of the appraisal in another bucket, if this bucket is structured like, you know, these are the steps that you're going to need to go through for this home buying process, and you put appraisal in there, just the very fact that it's in that context would sort of like, you know, lend that information set that you wanted to have.
Yeah, thank you. I think, spoiler alert, that's kind of how we ended up approaching it, was structuring it as a journey, so that people could orient themselves to the information based on where in the journey they were. And that seemed like an intuitive way for them to find the things they were looking for.
And one thing I'd like to just throw in there also, since, you know, this idea, right, of, you know, getting something in the right place in a navigation structure, right? Because it's something we talked a lot about at Intuit as well, right? We had teams who would build front pages, right, for nav. And I think this goes back to something that, you know, Maria was saying earlier, right? That you have to consider how people are actually using these things, right? And some of that's testing, and some of it is just looking at user behavior. And I think, you know, for like IA folks, right, we still tend to think in terms of like, well, to use the metaphor before, it's like a house or a book, right? There's a particular linear structure to things that I think a lot of us like think about naturally, right, for organizing information. And the way I used to, put it to folks at Intuit is that nobody comes through the front door anymore, right? So there's a lot of energy put into getting your top level verticals correct so that people know where they're going to find, this fourth level thing if they start in. But people generally don't look for information that way, right? Even if you have a rich, design site on a particular company, most people use Google, right? And
Yeah.
they find the thing that they want directly, right? So I say, instead of people coming through the front door, they can come through any window, right, in your house. So one of the things you need to think about for that is, for any given piece of information, any page, does it orient people to where they are, right? Because I think our traditional expectation is they come through the front door and then they have signposts guiding them, right? But if they've like sort of entered through the bathroom window, right, because they're looking for the soap and that's where the soap is, they go straight there. It's like, well, where are you now, right? Where do you go from here, right? What are the possible options? And I think, getting, information on what the actual user journeys are, like where do people show up? How many people actually come to the front page and drill down from the verticals versus how many people arrive from a Google search, for instance? I mean, it gives you some sense too of like how important it is to get your placement, quote unquote, right?
Mhm.
But even if you do want to build a nav structure, it's like doing things like a multiple inheritance, right? So that a deeper category can be arrived at from multiple paths is one way you can do it. I know one of the things I like is actually having a highly enriched taxonomy, right? So you don't just have a list of names and hierarchies, but you have definitions, you have additional keyword context, right? Because especially if people are using search to find stuff, right? You want to enrich the search experience so that when someone searches on something, they hit the right category, almost no matter what they put in, right? So you want to think about all the different ways people express this. And you might capture that through category structure rather than through sort of a hierarchical structure necessarily.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's like exactly the problem we're trying to solve. We actually have a phenomenal SEO, and our whole entire site is built towards capturing people through organic search. Now we're turning to the problem of, once they get here, how do we show them where else to go instead of they get what they came here for and then they leave. So yeah, that's kind of the exact problem we're trying to tackle. So yeah, all of that is very helpful to think about.
Every page is the front page.
It is. Yeah. I have an example of, so when we were testing the information architecture at Handshake, we had a couple of leaders be like, I don't like where you put the career center. That's not where I would go. It's like hidden. Our universities are going to be upset. And we had to kind of explain over and over again that this is literally just the framework for where we put things, but there's multiple entry points, right? So we're like, we can have a banner, like a standing banner on top of our homepage that links them to the career center, right? There's other like entry points, other things we can do. One of the things that I think is really underutilized in a lot of cases is empty states. So I'm dealing with that a lot at my current company. I work at Workato, and we do SaaS automation. So basically figure out how to connect all the different apps we're always using and automate kind of those processes. And there's just been a lot of designs where in the product, like, hey, you don't have X, Y, and Z yet. There's no one here yet. And it just says like add people, but there's an opportunity there, right? It's a blank page. You can use that to guide people. So every time someone's done with something, like give them something else, like, hey, like, once it gets more developed and more involved, you can really kind of see like, where do people go from this? Where are they naturally going? And then where do we want them to go? And how do we create, content that's going to get them there, or make design decisions that are going to get them there? Content and design work so closely together. I always joke that my job is basically making sure that everything possible is communicated visually, and that I catch anything that like designers maybe missed. So I have so many conversations where I'm like, hey, we don't actually need to say this. We can just, use design interaction design to move people to, where they want to be, and kind of nudge them. So yeah, empty states is super, yeah, it just see it in kind of every product that I use is very, very underutilized. So we could have a whole discussion on that as well. But that would be a different session.
Yeah, I might add that, like, my experience working on, online news sites shows how they're very good at, like, putting related content, to whatever the user is looking at, like in a sidebar,
Mhm.
and sort of utilizing things other than the standard, IA navigational schema.
And Maria, I got a question for you. Is there a question you didn't get yet that you expected to, that you thought, coming out of the content you had created earlier might, prompt a question from somebody?
Not off the top of my head. Let me go through. So I actually have a question for the group. I'm curious, has anyone done information architecture work here and have anything they want to share? Because when I was doing this, I was doing so much research, and it's actually shocking at how like little information is out there. A lot of the information is kind of the same. It's like, do tree testing, do what is it, card sorting, all of that, which is great. But I think especially for like what we were doing, we were introducing a lot of concepts and that weren't necessarily things that people could, it wasn't like a retail taxonomy, right? Where people already kind of know what these concepts are. We had to be really thoughtful about where we put them for discoverability, because we knew that naming and context had to kind of work together. So just curious, has anyone, worked with a really complicated, subject matter and then had to figure out how do we kind of organize all these different concepts in a creative way? And if you guys have any creative problem solving techniques for that.
I can throw in one thing on this in particular.
Mhm.
I don't want to take up more than my fair share of time. But I think, a big thing for us for looking at tests is, and I do think testing is important, right, in the right context. But you do have to, especially with the standard kinds of things that UX testing tends to do, right, is it can funnel you into a particular set of possible solutions. And the tree nav thing is a great one, right? So if
Yeah.
you're like saying, oh, should it be placed here? Should it be placed there? You're making a presupposition that this is how someone's going to find that information, right? So yeah, you can do the research and say, well, when we put it in this, subtree instead of this subtree, more people find it. That's great. But if that's not how people are looking for the information, it's like, you've got now a nice, slide deck and presentation that's not actually responsive to the problem you're trying to solve, right? So I do think, you need to be careful when you're doing testing, that you're not testing for stuff that's not actually useful.
Yeah,
That's,
absolutely. Yeah,
I had a second
actually,
part, but I lost it.
on the spot is hard, especially when you're passionately talking about something. Like I get into it, and then with my ADD, I'm like, wait, where did I start? Hold on, did I answer the question I was trying to answer? Yeah, I guess testing.
I'd love to
Oh,
to
go
share
for it.
something. Hi, my name's Emily, and sorry I'm not on camera, but doing double duty right now, watching a toddler. I am uncovering a lot of these challenges right now within information architecture and aligning to the content strategy and vice versa within a commercial real estate firm. And the biggest challenge that I have is so much of what folks have been talking through about today, but it's not shipping the org model. It's coming up with a taxonomy and a structure that allows us to scale the content and to scale our structure and kind of our product messaging into the future without kind of going back and constantly kind of reframing how the internal constituents are talking about the content of the products and solutions. So I've found that, like Optimal Workshop and the tree test is helpful because that it gives me so much of the data that can inform, hey, you know, as I'm trying to ask the right questions to get the information I need from those stakeholders, and then coming up with kind of what our methodology is for testing it, and then sharing that data back with them, validating it. And I think you had shared this as well. It's like, validate it with them, make sure it all feels right. And then once you've kind of once you've seen that full UI with all the terminology, then do some additional testing to validate that you got it right. So I'm kind of in that stage where I'm like really loving the concept mapping approach, which I have not done yet. So that's like, ooh, I have some marching orders as the next step, and I appreciate all of the content and context here.
Awesome. Yeah, content maps are great. I started doing them much more frequently when I realized, like, you put it in front of someone and, you know, they'll be saying, no, we need to name it this, we need to name it that. Like, here, what you think the constraints are often not what they actually are. So it's always interesting what those, you know, meetings uncover when I just put that in front of someone, like, hey, here's how they relate. This is what you're proposing, you know, where we put things, and like, this is going to be very confusing in the long run. So I think just like, I love tools that give you something to share that then people can kind of visualize and go, oh, okay, like, because and it's content, folks, like, it's just part, you know, the nature of the job. Like, everyone uses words, so we're constantly, you know, butting heads with opinions on what things should be, you know, where things should be, what they should be, because everyone's also an end user. So I love kind of rooting things in something a little bit more concrete, and I find that really helps facilitate these conversations.
I'm gonna just jump on your back on that one again too, because I think you're absolutely right. And you've said this a couple of times too, right? Which is, you know, there's a default towards wanting to name things, and that's not always the best solution.
Yeah.
Right. And especially when you start working in a narrow domain and people start using labels within product and they want those things defined, you can find that you can run out of words really quickly if you over define stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this is, I'm now gonna tie this to what I was saying before, right? It's like, question your own presuppositions, right? Because this is a good one for us too, right? If someone comes to you with a naming problem, the presupposition is, I need to make a name, or I need to delimit this name, right? And so one of the things you have to consider again is like, well, maybe not, right? It's like, is this, you know, something that is more of like, you know, usage guidance rather than this word means this in this context, in this product. Now you've cut it out from being able to be used anywhere else, right? And again, if you're working in a very specific horizontal and you have multiple products, multiple teams, you'll find yourself running out of words very, very quickly. So I think a general principle too is like, you know, what are my own presuppositions about what it is I'm doing, right? It's like, if someone asks me for a name, do I need to give them a name? If someone's asking me for a nav, do I need to give them a nav, right? Are these actually, you know, the presuppositions about what it is I'm trying to do? Are they the right presuppositions? Are there sometimes where actually this is a flat structure? Are there sometimes where no, this is just a word, it's not a name, right? So always question your own presuppositions too about what it is you're trying to accomplish and how you should accomplish it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, an example that always kills me is like, everywhere I've worked, there's always a label somewhere in the product that says like attendee or assignee. Like, and it's such an awkward, it's like, you don't really reuse that concept. Like, I have a whole other like presentation that I do on like naming strategy, and you're absolutely right. Like, it needs to be mutually exclusive, because if people are searching in the help center, again, everything is connected. If you're in the help center and you're searching for something that's confusing in the product, you can't have multiple help center articles show up in completely different contexts. You're going to be confused and not actually get the help that you need. So I'm a huge proponent for things like that. Like, instead of attendees, who's going, who's attending, like or who's going to be at this event? Because you're not really going to reference the attendees. You're going to reference the people you met, right? Or there's like just so many other connections that are important there. It's not really that bucket of like attendees. So yeah. And then to your point on, yeah, you completely hit it on the head. When people come to you with a naming problem, a lot of times it's not actually a naming problem. So one of the other tactics that I always use is take a step back and ask questions strategically to really get your stakeholder realize what they're actually trying to solve, because a lot of times people are just solving the wrong problem. So when I started, people were like, we need new information architecture, ours is bad. And I'm like, what's bad about it? And they're like, it's confusing. And I'm like, okay, but an information architecture overhaul is extremely expensive. Do you want to spend millions of dollars to potentially have our engineering re-architect this? What are you actually solving? And they're like, well, you know, our students don't know where to go. Like, well, you could redesign the homepage and send them there, right? Like, there's so many other like solutions that you could do. So in our case, it made sense ultimately after a lot of conversations and the set of problems we were trying to solve. But I think, yeah, like, and you know, and it's not out of like necessarily ignorance or anything. It's just everyone's moving so fast at these companies that they're like, I just need help. I think this is like what I think needs to happen. And they send it off to a content person and they're like, just do it. Right. And so I always try to take that extra time to align with what is the problem we're trying to solve. That shows you you're on the same team. And then kind of show them that there's more tools and content that you can actually, make people define the actual problems rather than giving your solutions. Absolutely. Any final thoughts?
Looks like
Good
we've got
question.
55 seconds on our countdown here, so let's get through those final thoughts if we've got them. Definitely spit them out from everybody.
Do you have any resources for somebody getting started? I'm reading, oh, you can't see it, How to Make Sense of Any Mess. I've been doing IA, but not formally. I honestly didn't even know I was doing it. So would love to just like dig in and like learn from more resources if you have any to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I will pull some together after the session, and feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to chat about this. IA is very near and dear to my heart and very, very complicated. So there's a lot to dig through together as we're all kind of figuring it out.
We've got a dedicated channel for this breakout in the Slack community. So Maria, if you want to post all the resources in there that you can think of, or anyone else, we can grab them all from the Slack group.
Absolutely.